Welcome, everybody. It's Ted Pitts, President and CEO of the South Carolina Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for joining and participating on this call that's going to talk about and cover the Paycheck Protection Plan. And to provide the information, we've got the subject matter experts who are living this on the front lines. We've got Fred Green, President and CEO of the South Carolina Bankers Association, and then David Lominack, who's the South Carolina Market President for TD Bank here in South Carolina. Fred's going to start us off and give us an overview about how we got to where we are today. And then we'll go to David, and he can kind of talk about what it's been like for a bank on the front lines dealing with the clients. So, Fred, I'm going to open it up and turn it over to you to kind of give us an overview, if you would.
Thank you, Ted. Good afternoon, everybody. Just a quick South Carolina Bankers, who we are, Bankers Association. There are 70 banks in the state of South Carolina that do business here, and they range from the largest that have a national presence to the smallest that has one office and 7 employees. Are all members of our association. Ted, I want to let your members know about something that you did several weeks ago, kind of brag on you a minute, but it was on Saturday the 21st that Ted called me and we talked about the CARES Act. At that point in time, we thought that it was going to pass through Congress maybe as early as that weekend. We decided to get together with the regional director of the South Carolina Small Business Administration and planned a meeting on Monday so that we could begin working out in advance how small business banks and the SBA could work together so that when the bill was passed, we would be as ready as we could be. So, Ted, thanks for arranging all that. Of course, everybody knows that bill was signed by the president on the 27th, and we issued a joint press release with the State Chamber, the South Carolina Bankers, and the SBA. So we pretty much covered the waterfront in terms of trying to get information out. Prior to that press release and going into law, we had alerted all of our members, all of the banks. Some had been SBA lenders, most had not. So we began working with all of those who had not been members to get them qualified to be able to take applications and make PPP loans. So continuing to fast forward, the first application was not even available until Friday, April 3rd. And virtually since Friday, April 3rd, and I should have said this, about 65 plus of the 70 banks doing business in the state are participating in this program. And when the application process came online that Friday, it was pretty choppy. There was a lot of volume trying to go through a narrow portal, and it took a long time to get things processed. SBA worked on it over the weekend. Speed increased, and banks were able to start getting more applications through on a more timely basis for that next week. Last week was the first time there was any guidance on the actual loan document itself. And banks who had dedicated all the resources to continue to process the applications. And I probably should have said this, every single application has to be submitted to the SBA for their approval. It's not a bank approved transaction. So about a week ago, those who had those applications approved early on started closing on the loans and issuing checks. Everybody that all the banks that are participating now are doing that. They're continuing to accept applications, and they are at the same time closing on those approved applications they had received over the last week. Just a stat real quick to put everything in perspective of how much we've done in really just a little less than 2 weeks. The SBA published some numbers as of Monday, and out of the $350 billion allocation from Congress, $250 billion had been allocated. There was a lot of statistics in there, and among the statistics was a state-by-state breakout. South Carolina, as of this past Monday, had processed and approved $2.8 billion under the PPP program. That represents greater than 14,000 applications. And to put that $2.8 billion in perspective, last year on a national basis, the SBA processed, again nationally, an average of $2 billion per month. And so in less than really 10 days in South Carolina, our bankers have been able to process $2.8 billion just in our state. So, Ted, thanks for again including me, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, David Lominack, if you'd like.
Yeah, David, why don't you take it from here and kind of give us the perspective over the last several weeks, what y'all have been dealing with at TD Bank. And, David's on our executive committee, so, a good chamber member and is involved, and he's going to give you a perspective. And then after David closes, we may go back to Fred to get an overview from what some other banks are telling him. And then we have some questions that have been submitted that we'll then go into after that. David, if you'll take it from here.
All right, very good. Ted, I've messed up a lot of conference calls lately, so I just want to confirm. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
All right. I've literally started conference calls and spoken for 5 minutes only to find out that nobody could hear me. So, listen, appreciate what you and Fred are doing for the entire state of South Carolina and all of our businesses, small businesses in particular. I'm going to make a couple of high-level comments, and then I'll give some observations from somebody who's living this 24/7 right now. I do want to just kind of take a step back for a second. Look, the bankers across the state are incredibly thankful for the Treasury and the SBA devising this program, and we are absolutely seeing the economic damage that small businesses across this entire state are going through right now. So we absolutely get it. And the bankers want nothing more than to get this money into the hands of small business owners as quickly as absolutely possible. And I do want to make a comment that I think bankers across the state, even before PPP started, had already begun to proactively reach out to customers and begin to offer loan payment deferrals, fee reversals, et cetera, to try to work with our businesses as we're all dealing with this same issue at the same time. So then PPP comes out, and as Fred talked about, in a normal year, the SBA processes approximately $28 billion in government guarantees, and here's $349 billion over the course of literally a few weeks. And it's a brand new program that we're all trying to learn. I've used the analogy, we've all heard the analogy about driving down the highway at 65 miles an hour and changing a tire. Well, this is literally building a spaceship while we're on the way to the moon. And so I think we all expected, and we've seen it, there have been some bumps along the way. And every day we're all learning a little bit more about PPP. And so it's been a bit bumpy, but in the grand scheme of things, I do believe this has been a very successful program thus far. The banks, in a lot of cases, whether you're a very small community bank or a large multinational bank, had to build processes internally in order to accommodate the flood of applications. And depending on the size of your bank, that depends on how long it took you to do that. As Fred mentioned, there were a few banks that opened up that Friday. Most of the banks took the weekend and were able to open their portals on Monday. And for certain banks, I assure you that was 24/7 over a 72-hour period, and trying to build something that in normal times would take months, like literally 6 months to build. And then to top it off, in a lot of cases, a lot of our bankers are having to work remotely, and our IT departments are having to work remotely. And so you add that in there, I do think for all of the banks across this state, it was pretty incredible that we were able to start accepting applications early that next week. I can assure you, since everybody's portal has been working, bankers across the state have been humping it to try to get these applications through their approval system and to the SBA to get the SBA's approval. I can assure you that literally there are groups working 24/7. We had bankers working Saturday and Sunday of this past Easter weekend, working to get as many applications as possible through the queue and submit to the SBA to gain approval. So again, I know it probably sounds like I'm trying to defend the bankers a little bit, and maybe I am, but it hurts my feelings a little bit when I see things on LinkedIn or otherwise that suggest the bankers aren't doing their part. And I just, as somebody who's living it every day and has lots of friends and competitors across this industry, across the state, I can promise you that every bank and banker in this state is doing whatever they can to help their customers and small businesses across the state. So a couple of observations I'll just mention, and this is definitely more from a TD perspective. I don't want to speak for other banks and what they may be seeing, but I suspect that some of this, if not all of it, is being seen across all of the banks. So you've heard that the banks wanted some level of indemnity from the SBA, that we weren't going to be held responsible if, for example, a business owner was not completely forthright in their application. And that ultimately was granted. However, the banks do have a responsibility to certify that the application is accurate and that the supporting documentation that's required as part of the application process is in file. Okay. So we do have to do some level of due diligence on each application that goes to the SBA for approval. When all of the documents are in order and the numbers are correct, it takes, let's just call it 20 to 30 minutes to get that application to the next stage. Okay. What we are seeing, probably a lot more than we expected, are incomplete or inaccurate applications. So, for example, there were some forms that were sample forms floating around before PPP went live, and some folks have downloaded those. Well, that wasn't the final form, and so we have to go back and get them to fill out a new form. Sometimes we're having issues where the payroll figures on the SBA application are not matching the backup documentation as shown on a 940 or a 941 or some other type of payroll document that they provided. And I don't mean by like $20. I mean by like tens of thousands of dollars. Sometimes it can be just simply missing some initials in a couple of places. If you've done the application, there's a section of yes, no boxes. And like we all tend to do sometimes when you get in that section that you feel like all of them are going to be no's, you just check all no's. But then you go back and you figure out that, number 8, for example, you were supposed to check yes. So we're having to go back and get that corrected. So those can sometimes take up to 2-3 hours of going back and forth with a customer. First, we got to track the customer down. In some cases, they've utilized a CPA, their CPA, to process the information, and we have to get to the CPA, who's obviously being inundated as well with other requests. So when it's inaccurate, we are really having to spend a lot of time working through those applications. And again, that goes back to that point of, well, gosh, the SBA is going to forgive the loan and then guarantee the loan for the bank anyway. What do you care? Well, I'm sure we'll get into it in a minute, but if you've ever had any sort of an SBA guaranteed loan, you know that all T's have to be crossed and I's have to be dotted. And this is going to be important when it comes time to apply for forgiveness for part or all of your PPP loan. So while it's a little bit painful and frustrating to make sure everything absolutely matches perfectly on the front end, I can assure everybody that will be a lot easier on the bank, the SBA, and most importantly, the customer, the small business owner, when it comes time to apply for that forgiveness. So when you start doing the math of the number of the applications that banks have accepted, and you start breaking it down, and you start thinking, okay, 50% of the applications require some level of follow up. Those take on average 2 to 2.5 hours to complete. You can see banks are bringing in resources from all over the place within the bank to try to get through as many of these applications as possible. In our bank, we have assistant store managers, we have store managers, we've got our treasury officers. We're pulling from all different places within the bank to help us get through as many of these applications as possible. And again, I know all of the banks are doing the same thing. So, Ted, I'll give it back to you. I know we want to go through some Q&A, but those are just kind of some high-level comments and then a few observations that I've seen on the front lines.
Ted, do you think from the different banks that obviously you're communicating with, anything different or to add, like from the community bank perspective, that things a little different?
Ted, I would add, and you were breaking up a little bit, but I think I got the question. First off, David did a great job talking about the process, the dedicated resources. Again, we have banks that are very, very small. Most of even the smaller ones, dedicated resources, and it's just anecdotal. But I guess it was the weekend before last on Sunday afternoon, I could get a call from one of our bank CEOs, and he said, "I'm just going over a loan application from a guy named Jim Green, that's kind of in your area where you grew up. Is any relationship?" I said, "Yeah, it's my younger brother's got a small business." And he said, "Well, he just let him know the CEO of the bank was looking at his." And so that, I guess that's anecdotal, but that does represent the resources that have been thrown at this. It did have the entire process is first come, first serve. So all bankers realize that, and the quicker they could get through the process of getting the applications approved, the quicker their small business customers could get that portion of the $350 allocated to their loan, and then the quicker the bank could then ultimately close on the loan and issue proceeds.
Okay, good. I'm gonna ask a timeline question. So in the pre-submitted questions, we got several questions about timeline. So David, you talked about application. So you don't push the application to the SBA until your bankers feel it's fully complete and ready to go to the SBA. And you talked about that could take, a couple days if things you're having to go back to customers and say, I need some more information. So once you push it to the SBA, how long is it taken for the SBA to let you know if it's been approved or not?
Yeah, so I'll answer that question. I'll back up just a little bit. If you thought about this, all right, so for example, we TD got about 25,000 applications on the first day we opened the portal, which was Monday a week ago. So, and as Fred mentioned, we, like every other bank, are going first come, first serve. So for some of those customers that we were able to pick up that file immediately on Monday afternoon and start working, it may have felt like a really quick process, right? If you were the 25,000th person who turned in their application on that Monday, it's taking us several more days to even get to that application to begin to process it. So I do want to make that caveat. And I think all banks are dealing with that because there was such a flood of applications in a short period of time. I do think banks have gotten quicker and are starting to process them more quickly. But once you've gone through the package and you have certified that everything is accurate and all of the supporting documentation is there, you can get an SBA approval reasonably quickly. Let's call it a day. Certainly no more than 2, but I think usually a day. And then you've got to go through the closing process where you have loan documents. It's a 2 or 3 page loan document that is an SBA loan document. It's not a bank loan document. And we can talk more about the loan documents in a second, but then you turn that back in and then funding's pretty quick. So, look, if everything's perfect, if I picked up an application on a Monday, I should be able to fund that loan probably by Thursday or Friday. But again, the application's got to be right. And, We have had some trouble. E-Tran is the SBA approval system. It has gone out a few times, as Fred mentioned, because of the influx of applications and volume. But again, assuming all is working, it can be a 4 to 5 day process from start to finish. And in some cases, people are doing it quicker, and that's fantastic.
And then as far as approval, SBA says, yes, this file's been approved. This has been approved. We're going to lend this customer the money. What's the average in funding the loan? How long has that typically been running?
So that 4 to 5 days, Ted, that I mentioned, that's from the time the banker picks it up to certify it to the time the money hits the account. Okay. So once the SBA approves it, you should, and assuming the customer can return the loan documents relatively quickly, 2 to 3 days.
Okay. Yeah.
Before the money's in their account.
And Ted, let me jump in on that too, just to add a little more clarification. Early on, that first day, Friday, I guess now 2 weeks ago, that applications were available. It may have taken 8 hours to get one application approved by one bank. So the complication that David mentioned with the SBA portal had to do with bandwidth early on. The other complication is that the access to that portal is not granted to a bank. It is granted to individuals that have to be certified within that bank. And then those individuals can only process one loan at a time. They can't batch them and send in a big group. So that adds to the time period. The other thing I would add is that the loan, the loan guidance that was issued by SBA didn't even come out until last week. And so even though some banks had maybe started the Friday or the Monday that it was available, for several days, even after it had received SBA approval, they couldn't close because there was no guidance on, what the loan terms would be, the loan documents, things like that. So that added to the confusion, but all that is behind us now. Banks are still very actively processing applications and very quickly closing on those approved applications.
And Ted, just to stress, we're all still working through the backlog that started on the first day that a particular bank's portal opened. So I want to make sure that's clear.
Right. Yeah. No, understood. Let's talk a little bit about the documents. So, there were some questions about, do I have to sign a personal guarantee? Do the documents am I going to be audited at the end of this process in order to get the loan forgiveness? Talk a little bit about what we know about the documents and then what we maybe could anticipate on the back end.
Sorry, you want to start? And I'll
yeah. So the SBA PPP loan does not require a personal guarantee. It does require, however, a personal attestation that all of the information is accurate, and the implication that if money is granted and the information was then deemed to be inaccurate, there could be significant personal liability. So there's not a guarantee of the loan, but there is a statement of personal liability in the event information was inaccurate. On the back end, I'll just very quickly say, and then turn it back over to David, that at this point in time, there has been nothing issued from the SBA on the documents, on the certification, on the requirements, on the forms, and the rules associated with their forgiving they're forgiving a portion of the loan. So the way it would work is the bank who is administering this loan would have contact from a customer and say, I would like to have a certain portion of this loan forgiven. That customer would then have to present to the bank documentation showing that they kept those employees on the payroll during that 8-week period of time. That's what this whole program is about. Presumably the bank would then forward whatever certification, documentation to the SBA, along with the form that is yet to be, invented. And then, SBA makes that decision. So that's the high level overview of the process. Again, nothing's been written in terms of the detail. You mentioned audit. It's not going to be a CPA audit of the financials, but there will be some documentation, probably from some third party provider like your payroll service, things like that, where you do document that you kept these employees on the payroll for that 8-week period of time you're asking to be forgiven. So, David, let me bounce it back to you.
Well, no, I think you said it really well. And when I've talked to customers about this, I've said, listen, we got to take a really big step back and remember that the point of this entire program is to keep as many people employed as possible. So keep very, very good records from your loan proceeds, how you paid employees through this 8-week period. I know some companies have said, well, geez, I'm shut down. So, does that make sense to hire people and they don't have anything to do? That's going to have to be a decision that you make for yourself and for your employees. If you accept the money, even if you're closed down and you're required to be closed down, you still have to demonstrate that you paid employees. Okay. Again, the point being this is about protecting employee payroll. So you're going to have to think through that, obviously consult with your CPA and your attorney on that. But again, I can't stress it enough because we're not exactly sure what the documentation requirements are going to be on the back end of this for the forgiveness portion, like Fred mentioned. So just keep very accurate records, very detailed records, and be able to clearly demonstrate that you kept people on the payroll with this money during this period of time.
Thank you. And, one thing that y'all stress, and we'll just touch on it here because there were several questions about this, people that have furloughed employees, correct me if I'm wrong, but they should not apply for the loan and put it in the bank and say, when I bring them back to work in 6 weeks or 10 weeks, I'm then going to use this money to pay them. That's something that was not intended for the PPP, and likely you would not get that piece forgiven. It's for covering payroll during the 8-week period. Do you have anything to add to that, Fred or David?
What I would add, Ted, is first off, the documentation requirements on that back end haven't been issued, as we both just said. But I would give very high odds that part of that documentation will be a question such as, were any of these employees on unemployment or furloughed and paid, by the federal government while you're counting them? And so, said another way, that's probably going to be, question number one.
And then we had several questions about 1099, somebody that has an independent contractor, or somebody that's working in their business. Do those expenses, do we think they're going to count towards loan forgiveness?
Fred, you want me to jump in on that one?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'll start, and then you can fix anything I say the wrong way. When we all first read the rules that came out originally, in my opinion, there was some conflicting direction on whether 1099 employees counted in the payroll calculation or not. Again, in my opinion, there were some places in the document that suggested you could count them, and then there were other places that suggested independent contractors did not count because they would be allowed to apply for PPP on their own. Ultimately, the follow-up guidance was 1099 employees should not be counted in an employer's payroll calculation. Okay. So if you have 10 employees and 2 of them are 1099, You need to take those 2 out and only focus on the 8. Okay. As of, I guess technically as of last Friday, I'm not sure, some banks may be different on when they started accepting them, but as of last Friday, according to the Treasury and the SBA, independent contractors and sole proprietors could begin to apply for PPP for themselves. So that avoided any potential double dipping. But again, and we have found, I talked about some of the applications that may be off. In some cases, Ted, we have found that employers included 1099 employees, and so we're having to go back to the business owner and get those subtracted out because you just can't include those.
And
David, go ahead, Fred.
Ted, what I would add, going back to David's comment, independent contractor and the contractors and the sole proprietors, self-employed, that was turned on by the SBA as of last Friday. But again, as everything else, in effect, the calculation for the application, the rules, the guidance, and all of that wasn't issued until last night. So even though the application might have been available on the independent contractors, the bank couldn't do anything with it because it didn't know what documents to receive until last night. So now they're gearing up to accept those applications today.
Yeah, and also in addition, just to follow up on the 1099 and sole proprietors, they also, I think, through the CARES Act, were made eligible for potentially some unemployment benefits. So folks ought to check that route as well. We've talked a little bit here about the 8-week period. Do we know exactly when the 8-week period started and when it's going to end or when it's going to run through? I know there was some question about that.
Ted, I don't have that level of detail. I just, the best website I would suggest everybody go to is treasury.gov/cares, and then it gets into the details of the program. But I haven't put it down on my calendar yet.
Okay.
Yeah, Ted, I agree with Fred that I would want people to go to the Treasury website and review the rule for themselves. Again, in thinking about the spirit of this program, I would encourage a business owner to consider the clock to start ticking the day they receive those funds in their account.
Yeah, I think that's a good point for folks to take into account. So if you were to, again, check with the federal government, but if you were to receive those funds, you wouldn't want to wait for the 8-week period to start in 8 weeks. You would want that clock likely to start ticking when you have those funds to be able to pay your employees.
Yes.
So that is one thing that I think there's a question we need to get clarification on, but just as a practice, I think the spirit of the law makes it easier to try to figure out what you should be doing. When we look at full-time versus part-time employees, so we have several questions related to, whether I qualify full-time versus part-time. David, how is TD Bank looking at that 500 employee restriction and different things related to the number of employees?
Yeah, so unfortunately, Ted, I don't know that I have the definitive answer at this moment. I can certainly follow up with you. Again, in keeping with the spirit of the agreement, we have considered payroll to be payroll, whether that's a 20-hour person, a 30-hour person, or a 40-hour person. We've kind of said payroll is payroll. It does get a little bit tricky for those companies that may have, say, 600 employees, but only 500 FTEs because of the part-time. I need to check in honestly and determine what decision we made on that, because I don't know the definitive answer. But for those under 500, if the question is simply about do part-time employees count, the answer is yes.
Okay, good. Fred, anything to add on that?
No, David covered it well.
Okay, and then we had a question or two about related. So let's say I received the funds, my loan is funded, and I decided to pay it all out in a lump sum or in a bonus type fashion, during that 8-week period. What do we think? How do we think? I know we don't know for sure, but how do we think that would be perceived if, as long as it was spent on payroll, but I did it in a bonus type fashion? Would there be concerns around that?
Again, my suggestion is that the specific rules haven't been issued. If presumably the question would be, what was the payroll during this 8-week period of time? That's an obvious. That what is less obvious is, give us the actual records on when you distributed it, and then going back to an earlier answer, earlier comment, were any of these that you're including paying, did any of them receive unemployment benefits or furlough benefits?
Thank you. And then, really just a couple more questions. I know that we've got to hop off here in a second, and sorry we can't answer every individual person's question, but these questions were pre-submitted, and we're going through them as fast as we can. When you look at expenses, so can we talk a little bit about, we know payroll is obviously the biggest piece of it. Can either one of you talk about how the other expenses piece may be looked at and what it may include and maybe what it may not include? Either one of you have any thoughts on that?
David, y'all have been processing a lot of different applications with a lot of different data, but from a high level, it's mortgage payments, not a whole lot of categories. Mortgage payments, maybe lease payments, things like that. David, you could add more to it.
Yeah, well, and of course, all of this goes back to the whole forgiveness piece, right? And as Fred has said a couple of times, we don't have that guidance yet. And of course, on the front end, we're only determining the loan amount based on 2.5 times average monthly payroll. So, but the guidance that we've seen is that in addition to payroll, what else is eligible is mortgage or rent payments, and then utility payments. So I would, again, haven't seen the final guidance on forgiveness, but I would stick as closely as possible to those categories: payroll, mortgage/rent, and then utilities as possible. And I think you would be in a good place if you do that. If you, I'm being extreme, but if you go out and buy a new boat, that's not going to count. But if you be less extreme, I think, paying off a past due balance for a vendor, I don't think that's going to necessarily fall into the forgiveness category. Again, with the caveat, I haven't seen the details, but I think the spirit is keep businesses open and keep the lights on and keep employees paid. That's the spirit of the program, and you want to stay as closely to that as possible.
Okay, yeah, that's very helpful. Let's transition to, I guess, what the future holds. So, we've talked, and I've seen the SBA numbers as well. The original $351 billion allocation, I mean, is close, and there's probably enough applications already in the pipeline. It's close to being fully utilized, and we know that Congress, the Senate specifically, has been talking about passing round 2 that would fund an additional $250 billion. Hard to say billion. $250 billion of available proceeds. What advice do we have for folks that maybe haven't applied yet, or if you have applied and you haven't heard back yet, what advice can we talk to them, and what do we see potentially coming out of a round 2?
So maybe, David, I'll start off. For those that have applied and haven't heard back, their bank is still working on that application, trying to have it processed where it will go into the first 350 billion. If an application that has been submitted to a bank, the clock runs out and the 350 is full, I suspect that application would be suspended within that bank pending additional funds, and then would go to the front of the line on the second tranche. The second tranche, even though it's in the Senate, there's a number of different aspects of it that is being debated. And so it could be, as an example, that the application for the second tranche is significantly different than the first. I would suspect, again, if that is the case, the banks would contact those customers whose application was already in queue and get them to resubmit under the new form. That's how I would see it working. I will say there will be a gap in time. The 350 will run out before the 250 comes in. So that will be something that all of the banks, as well as their small business customers, will have to deal with until the 250 comes back out.
Yeah, Ted, I'll just jump in, and I only want to speak for our bank when I say this, but I can say certainly at my level, we have not even begun to think about what happens when the 349 runs out, because any time we spend thinking about that is time we're not spending process all the applications that we have in our queue at this moment. So I'm not sure at this moment how things are going to look once the 349 runs out and what the process will be, assuming we get an additional allocation of 250. Part of your question was, what should a small business do if they haven't gotten a response yet to an application that they submitted? I know this is incredibly difficult, and it's easy for me to say this, but the reality is, if you call your banker every day or your branch manager who's helping shepherd this through the process, checking on it, again, it's time that they're taking the call and checking on it, and time that they're not processing more applications. So to the extent possible, I would just say be a little bit patient. We've still got a few more days left, and the banks are pushing these through as fast as they can. If you just can't stand it, then you just need to call your banker who's helping you with this application and see if they can tell you where in the process it might be. The important thing to ultimately have is what's called an ETRAN account number. And that's when it has been approved by the SBA and those dollars have been allocated to you as a participant in PPP. So if you speak to your banker, you can ask them if that's gotten to that process yet. And once you get there, you can take a deep breath, because that means the funds have been allocated.
All right. Thank you. And as far as, again, if you haven't applied yet, you need to contact your banker. You need to, to get in line, whether you're in line for the first tranche or the second tranche. We're getting close to the time, Portil. Fred, do you have anything to add before we pop off the call?
Ted, I'd just like to maybe just end with maybe almost where we started. Our entire banking community in the state has been 100% focused on this product to be able to help their small business clients. We recognized from the very beginning, even when it was talked about, the dollars would be allocated fairly quickly. And so the bankers have done everything I think they can, 24/7 kind of a working environment to process applications as rapidly as possible. And as David said also in the beginning, 2.8 billion in really less than 10 days in South Carolina that compares to $2 billion nationally on average, says that, again, we've been successful with it. So thanks again for allowing me to participate, and I would be happy to answer any other questions later if you have any that come in.
All right, we'll do it. Thank you, Fred, for participating. David, what about you? What would you close with?
I would just say, again, I do want to thank you, Ted, and certainly you, Fred, for y'all's help in bringing the appropriate parties together as we all learn this and work through it together. We've learned a lot from each other when we get on calls like this and others that you guys have held and created a platform for us all to ask questions of one another. So thank you for your leadership through PPP. Listen, again, maybe I'll say in defense of all the bankers across the state of South Carolina, I assure you they are at the table fighting for every one of their customers. We want everybody who applied for a PPP loan to get it, whether it's in the first tranche or the second tranche. We are doing everything we possibly can, working a lot of long hours to get these applications through. So I promise you that we're focused on it. We hear you, and maybe more than anybody recognize that our small businesses across this state need this money. We understand the economic damage that's occurring right now, and this is an important part of that recovery process. So we're taking that job and our role in this process very seriously.